My name's Henry, and I've been a therapist for a really long time. Maybe I'll just start by introducing myself. So I started off life, my career as a therapist, as a trauma counselor, working for victim support, using an approach called traumatic incident reduction. And maybe one theme through my life, really, in terms of studying things is I always love to try and see both sides of the polarity. Today, with the previous two talks, we've heard lots of these polarities of like psycholytic, psychedelic, primary consciousness, secondary consciousness. And there's lots of different camps of therapy in the world. And one of my passions is trying to unite them all together. So, another theme that we're going to be looking at today is how there's a tension in research itself in terms of individual treatments and group data, because most research studies often look at group data, but then clinicians have to treat individuals, and of course individuals are not groups, they're not averages. So this is another polarity actually within research to address. How do we deal with that? Also, what we're going to be looking at is I'm going to be presenting some study data where we look at some long-term follow-up data in terms of trying to understand why is it that some people maintain their benefits that they gain from psychedelic therapy, and why is it that for some other people it can fade. And yeah, there's even some data around that in some of the depression studies, quite often as many as 50% relapse after 6 months. So again, as a kind of therapy geek, I'm quite passionate about trying to figure stuff out like that. And what is that? So that is, again, an intention behind the study that I put together back, I think it started in 2019, and collected a lot of data of multiple different kinds of data sets, both quantitative and qualitative data, to try and look into that. Yeah, so another tension there is, which I've kind of already touched on, is the FDA. There are very particular processes of how you research therapies and make them established and evidence-based, but the tools that are used for, the randomized control trial is a particular kind of tool that's great for some things, and it's not necessarily great for everything. Just like any tool, just like a screwdriver is great for screws, but it's not very good for nails. I think this metaphor of tools and how we can develop tools to be more precise and more responsive is another theme that we're going to have in this talk. So yeah, I'm really interested in, this morning I was actually listening to that Sitting Around the Fire track by Ram Dass and is it John Hopkins, where the very first thing he says in the recording is, "Beyond all polarities I am," or something like that, he says. So it's another kind of theme of what we're looking at. Also, of course, there's very recently actually a new paper came out of highlighting how we really need to focus on therapeutic processes, and randomized controlled trials tend to focus on outcomes, group data. We aggregate data together to look at an average outcome, which is helpful, but we also need, it's not either or, it's kind of both. It's also really important to have process data. And I'm very influenced by an association called the Association of Contextual-Behavioural Science that developed acceptance and commitment therapy, and for decades they've been pushing to advance new research methods like that. So, what's on this slide? So another part of what we're doing here is looking at how we might move towards precision medicine, or that's already happening in many branches of medicine. New theories are emerging, such as the network theory of mental disorders, how we're looking at how different constellations of symptoms actually interact for individuals, rather than trying to just have one label like depression, you're depressed, that's it. I think the next slide, this is an example of how with particular assessments. In just an hour or so, you can often do an assessment like this. This would be for an individual where their depression might look like this. They might have a history of being bullied or have had critical parents, lack of sleep, unemployment, and all these things might contribute to the self-worth. And this is an example of how within a network, a particular node in the network might have a central position, such as low self-worth. And I think a lot of psychedelic therapists would agree that, or well, psychotherapists generally would agree that self-worth is often a theme. Just a little, here's just some thoughts on this whole idea of evolving tools. So if we look at normal tools, such as an axe or something for cutting wood, here you can see how axes became perhaps sharper with better materials. Then someone thought up the idea of having a saw. So again, it's bringing the same process of cutting wood, something sharp rubbing against or making contact with wood, but we can have better and better ways of actually applying that same process. So I'm thinking, how do we do that for therapy? What's the future of therapy going to look like as the tools get more and more advanced? And there's a lot of, in terms of the actual processes, there is already quite a lot of consensus. There's a lot of research into the importance of things like acceptance, decentering. If you're not familiar with that, it's kind of a mindfulness term for stepping back from your thinking and seeing it as thinking rather than seeing it as reality. Self-transcendence, perspective taking. There's many different research efforts to clarify what these are, but how do we actually apply them in very particular cases and particular circumstances? So just very briefly, I'll say about acceptance and commitment therapy. Yeah, it's a very evidence-based. It has over 1,000 randomized control trials, actually. Even though it's a big advocate of doing more than randomized control trials, it has over 1,000 randomized control trials that have been completed. Of course, they often struggle with statistical power and things like that. But it's very much a transorientational approach. And one element of it that I'd like to emphasize, which is relevant to this presentation, is non-directive methods and active-directive or particularly directive methods can be integrated. Again, it's a bit of a polarity that I think we can transcend. So to transcend that polarity and clarify, and that's the thing that I appreciate about the PSIP videos that we just saw in the presentation that we just had from Sarge, is that it is helpful to be directive. Another thought that I have about how do we integrate all therapies into one therapy is we need to break it down to basics, and one of the basics is barriers. We have both inner barriers, inner psychological barriers, and we have outer systemic barriers. And do we actually face those barriers or not? And if we can't be directive, if we're thinking, well, we mustn't be directive, or I'm afraid of being too directive, which definitely could be a legitimate concern, then perhaps we're not going to face those barriers. So I think being able to be directive in the right way at the right time is critical to having an efficient therapy. So up here, kind of what I'm highlighting here in this rather large table, I don't expect you to read it all, but a lot of it is summed up in what it says on the very bottom line. It says, all these modalities can be used to help the person to experience their own self-content more vividly so that they can make choices to move beyond it. So again, that's part of what we just saw in the videos of the PSIP therapy. How do you have somebody go into those barriers? And maybe one other thing I'd say about the directiveness, non-directiveness debate is that as a therapist, it's basically impossible to be non-directive. We need much clearer language about these things. The use of the term inner healing intelligence has been some people have gone as far as saying it's caused some confusion or controversy. If you're not familiar with the inner healing intelligence, it's a term that has been around psychedelic therapy for a long time and definitely has great validity, but it's not as simple as just trust the inner healing intelligence no matter what, because sometimes there's an inner critic or an inner dictator to say no, don't go there, don't grow, stay as you are. So what do you do then? Do you just leave the person to their own devices, or are there safe ways of intervening? And so in this kind of way of trying to clarify how you do intervene, what I've put up here is a whole scale going from left to right, becoming increasingly directive. But all of these ways of being directive are about staying within that individual's own frame of reference, and having them relate to their experience that is their own experience. One of the least ways of being directive, of course, is just being present, but just your very presence as a therapist probably suggests something that maybe they can heal, or maybe you can help them, even if you're not really doing anything, but just calling yourself a therapist. You can then have somebody focus on more specific aspects of their experience. If they say, oh, I feel afraid, you could say, where do you feel that in your body? It's one classic therapy question, which again is it's directive. You're having them narrow their focus. Torsten was talking about narrowing focus of awareness. Then you can even bring whole other models that a person can slot their experience into, such as parts work. Some of you will be familiar with internal family systems therapy, where you could say, well, that thought and that fear, maybe it belongs to a part of you. What's it like? Does that work for you if you see it from that angle? So we can present new perspectives. Then we can even frame someone's behavior in terms of, does doing that behavior carry you towards what you really want in life, or does it keep you stuck in a pattern that you don't want to be stuck in? And again, it's, so these are all different ways of looking at directiveness, going all the way up to more when you in more psychodynamic relating on the far right is one way you could refer to when the person needs more of a corrective experience. Again, we saw that in the video that just passed. But anyway, I've probably said enough about that. There's also another really fundamental part of acceptance and commitment therapy and contextual-behavioural science that I think helps unite all therapists, because we have all these different camps of therapy all wanting to promote themselves, which is fine, especially if there's many, many really helpful therapies out there. But it can be confusing which ones you study. So it would be useful if we could kind of see it all within one view. And so I really like this metaphor of a black hole. So there are certain things, like you could call it the subconscious, that you're not really aware of because you're not conscious of it. And yet it's still possible to access that stuff in terms of how you move around it. And how we become more aware of that is by analyzing behavior all the time. So I think that is a useful way of uniting a lot of these things. One other thing, another polarity that I'd like to kind of transcend ideally is this one between kind of cognitive and somatic. So it's true that, in my view, it's true that being in the body and feeling is absolutely critical to deeper therapy. I think I might go as far as saying that. However, I wouldn't say that being cognitive, the use of language, story is always, the function of that is not always to block your awareness of your inner experiencing. You can label real experiences with language. So language can be used to actually carry you into your direct experiencing. There's therapies like Gendlin's focusing, which makes use of that consistently. So getting to acceptance and commitment therapy, in a nutshell, we have mindfulness processes, but we also very much embed it within behavioral processes. We're always framing any behavior in terms of whether it moves you towards what's important to you, or does it move you away from what's important to you. On the left, so there we have these mindfulness processes of acceptance, seeing thoughts just as thoughts. Or can I allow my experience to be as it is? Again, a way of carrying you more directly into your ongoing direct inner experience. Then there's very much this part of the self. So in the Spectrum of Selves model, what we're doing is looking at how we can map these processes onto psychedelic phenomenology. Over there on the left, we have many examples of things in psychedelic literature that people experience. I think trauma is really, really critical. Again, if are we going to face the barriers to change or not? I think most people have some form of trauma, and especially what's now often referred to as small t trauma, which could be neglect or just a period of your life where your needs weren't getting met. So there isn't this very clear experience to make it stand out to you, and yet it's still there. It still affects your sense of self, and it can be a barrier to you living the life that you want to live. So yeah, so if we take this and mix them together like a Sudoku puzzle, this is one way you could get it all to slot together. So it's turning it into one quite simple scale of on this traumatized end. That's where often the experience that you have conditioned yourself or do your best to not experience lurks. And at the other end of the scale, we can also see it as a scale of psychological flexibility, or where the defenses to experiencing are thinned out as the psychedelic enhances the process. So, there's very much the parts are integrated into this model. So it integrates internal family systems with acceptance and commitment therapy processes. In the table on the right, you can see these processes, of evidence-based processes of things like cognitive diffusion, values, present moment, again, acceptance. There are lab-based studies to see if these things really exist or not, as well as looking at how we apply them in a therapeutic context. So, just got some little examples of how you could use this to guide your therapeutic interventions. So part of what it's highlighting is that we have these many selves, and they can serve different purposes. That there are ones that often are a barrier, and there are ones that are more expanded. There's compassion there. So yeah, and therefore one of the simplest things that seems to emerge in psychedelic therapy is during a vivid experience that you have on a psychedelic, it might be necessary, well, it will be an essential part of the therapy will be to re-experience that, to make sense of that, to do something with that. So during the integration phase, you're going to want to return to that. So this is another major theme in this presentation, in that when we get to the study data, you'll see that we explored how returning to the actual experiences from the psychedelic could be helpful to extend the benefits of the psychedelic therapy. So this is an example of something you might actually do. Tempted to even demonstrate it, but maybe I don't have a huge amount of time. So a person can, this is an example also how language can carry you into direct experiencing. This very simple question, what's it like to experience something? Let me think of an example. What's it like to experience coming home to see my family? If I focus on that question, I'm going to feel things in my body, and I'm going to be able to, as I try to put them into words, even though the words are not going to completely do justice to the actual experience. I'm not saying that, and the words certainly aren't the same as the experience. Those words really can point to the experience and carry me into that experience. And if I just use a bit of repetition of describing those things, I will actually start to feel those experiences in my body. Another example of something we used on the study a lot was looking at having a person practice actually experiencing different perspectives. So very often a barrier at some point is going to come up. You could have the thought, I'm not good enough, for example, is one very common thought, or some version of that. And then you can imagine, well, from a compassionate perspective, how would you relate to that? So, the person might come up with, I'm as good as anyone else. And then if you make an actual practical exercise out of this, of actually experiencing, because again, in terms of trying to unite all therapists, I think it's one thing that most therapists seem to agree on is that we need a way to go experiential. The more experiential we can be, the less in the head we are. We can use language to point to our experience and even capture our experience to some degree. I really like what Chris Beisch, some of you may have heard of Chris Beisch, who explored LSD with, I think, 73 sessions over a 20-year period. And what he says is language both cloaks and reveals. So it's not language as a barrier and don't use it because it's not real experience. It's more, if you use it wisely, if you use the tool of language mindfully, it can even clarify some aspect of your direct experience. So anyway, jumping back to this, if it's a part that is upset, it's very likely as you do this exercise, the emotion from that part, whether it's a child part or a really traumatized part or a critical part that's angry, it's all about being able to make contact with that, those parts, those thoughts, those parts of you experientially. Another thing we tried on the retreats, so I've been running retreats where we've explored these methods and collected a lot of data to try and understand better how these things can be helpful and how to improve. So, soon we'll be looking at the research data, which is just going to be an example of how we can continue to develop a model based on multiple data sets. So this is something we tried on the retreat, which was a way of where a person could at will reconnect with the psychedelic experience and continue different aspects of the psychedelic experience and continue to process it. Continue to make sense of it. There could be positive insights that you want to inform your life, as well as the difficult stuff that you really need to process, that you need to work through, you need to make peace with. So then one other little example here is how once that inner phase of work has been done, then it's the outer phase of how is this actually going to relate to your life? If you don't change your life, your habits, then I think it's more likely going to be in that category of participants who drift back to not feeling as inspired as they did for the 2 weeks or month after the psychedelic experience. This is a way of relating it systemically and on multiple levels in your life, different domains in your life, how different parts might not want you to do well and might make choices, or a child part or a critical part might not do so well in relationships, but a compassionate part might make different choices. And also, as you only have one life, or at least at a time, and there's limited time in the day, then whenever you change one part of your life, it's going to impact other parts of your life. So if you can mindfully find a new alignment that can help reinforce the new choices that you're making, then I think that can be really helpful. But this is still more on a theoretical level. Well, actually, to be honest, it does align with a lot of research, non-psychedelic therapy research, but therapy research, psychotherapy research. So anyway, onto the study. How long I've got left? So just a little bit on the study data. So yes, an overview. So we had a lot of different parts here. Had daily measures of psychological flexibility, negative emotion, life satisfaction, things like that. We also had longer questionnaires at these 4 different time points, where we could measure things like depression, anxiety, stress. And then what I think I was particularly interested in was to try and understand why was it that some people would maintain their benefits and others wouldn't. So just generally, we didn't have a control group, but of people who actually gave us all 4 time points, so we had 34, and we found statistical significant changes through those 4 time points using an ANOVA statistical analysis, which, in psychedelic research, that's not surprising. What's interesting is trying to understand how different treatments might have different effects. I don't have lots of time, so I'm going to skip past that. So anyway, also around maybe quarter of the way into the study, we had a couple of participants where I tried out a method for accessing the psychedelic experience when one participant said, it's fading, I don't feel so inspired anymore, I feel like it's kind of gone, it's starting to go. And I thought, well, how can we turbocharge or intensify, amplify the access of these different states without actually taking drugs? Is that possible? So here are a couple of quotes after trying that. So this is a method that's originally designed for trauma, where you repetitively re-experience both with and without language. So you do it silently in your mind, and then you recount it as well. You see if you can find words that can help pin down something of that experience. What I learned was that there is a way to re-experience the trip in such a way that it's available to me every day. So this is a very powerful effect. I really felt the emotions that were related to this. They weren't as strong, but they went in that direction. So this was a very, very useful thing. Then another participant in the same cohort that I also tried this out, I only tried it on 2 people in this cohort. The most powerful integration exercise for me, I was asked to recall the psychedelic experiences that I had, and also any experiences that I had during the whole retreat, which were very kind of powerful. It kind of felt like I was back there again, and I got that real kind of afterglow feeling for the rest of the evening, which was really nice. So this is, even though it's a behavioral exercise using language, a person is actually re-accessing for an sustained, for a period of hours, similar emotional states. So what we did was we started applying that more and more, and because it seemed this was, it wasn't around what you would call a randomized control trial. It wasn't randomized. It was about, this is in the field, doing the best we can, but also collecting lots of data. So again, it's kind of trying to take both elements of both research designs, of trying to get looking at larger effect sizes, but also getting responding to individual needs and collecting data on that. So. Yeah, so I'm kind of calling it RI rope, repetitive imaginal re-experiencing of psychedelic experience. It's probably not going to catch on as a term, but it's just for the just for this presentation, and related traumatic memories. So very often this is another thing that's pretty well established in therapy research, therapy theory, that of course as we access traumatic memories, if those are barriers, then it's likely to be easier to integrate things long term. So this is just the ANOVA. So here what we're doing is looking at different treatments. So we ended up with, I think in the end, 21 people ended up having that kind of RI rope or repetitive imaginal exposure. So this is looking at valued living. So, but one issue with the data, it kind of looked, when I first saw this, I thought, wow, this looks exciting. One issue with this data, though, is you can see the 4th time point, 7 to 12 months. So there's, for an ANOVA to get proper statistical significance, you'd want the 4th time point to be measured more or less at the same time. And in this case, we had it was extended over quite a period. But just to let you know, the one that's at the top with that was about 8 months later, and the other on average, and the lower one that was getting nearly 11 months on average. So anyway, we did get nice shaped graphs like this, where it looks like one is following a different pattern to the other. So these are for psychological flexibility, valued living, depression. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to get straight to the point. So also, but that we all know that we're trying to get large enough sample sizes is really difficult. So an alternative that we had in this study is by collecting. This is daily data. This is an individual person, and we have many of these for I think you must be around 45, 50 people, where we have graphs like this. And what we discovered using a new statistical method is that this is another way of detecting difference between groups. So with the ANOVA, or just using depression measures at 3 or 4 time points, you can try and say, well, is one a lot less depressed than the other? This is a way of actually processing daily data that looks, daily data like this. So you actually get each individual gets their own statistically significant model. And what we found was that there were two subgroups at around just after the therapy, around a week after. It's taken from data across about a 2-month period. And there was this particular imaginal reviewing of your experience did have an effect when we did a statistical test, the phi coefficient, and so there was 0.5 effect of the therapy actually predicting subgroup, which to some degree, now I have to stop. Ben says so. Thank you.